Tholin, if you would be so kind.
Okay.
Thank you. So, just starting off as a little bit of a preface as to why this matters. More specifically, why this kind of matters to me. This is my corner of a much larger lore project we've been doing in Avalikin, and I've been utterly ecstatic to be able to help out. It's been fantastic being able to connect with so many different birds, spend so much time and to actually kind of build and give into this thing that I've been welcomed into to help grow. And that just makes me beyond the moon, beyond several moons even. This is a brief overview of the history that we have so far. If you would be so kind as to go ahead, Tholin. What we're going to be, and specifically me, but Tholin is also going to have a portion of the presentation to go over as well, is we're going to go over kind of, I don't want to say a grade school understanding of history as it is so far, because it kind of feels a little bit too like toned down, but it's kind of a rough outline of the Illuminate, the rise of it, the fall of it, and kind of the expansion outwards. It's, if you were to go up to a bird on the street and say, hey, do you remember this happening? This is what they would probably know. It's a cursory glance at everything, and it's designed more to be a primer of anything to wider Avali history as a whole. In addition, we're keeping it vague for several reasons, another which of being just that there is so much history and so much opportunity to write and insert your own spin on it. There's room everywhere for every bird to kind of fit in, to go off of, to take in and absorb. Like I said, it's just a little bit of a history for everybody. This is rough, but it's there as a foundation to build off of. The tallest towers all start with a single brick on the ground. Go ahead, Tholin. Thank you, my dear. So we have here a timeline. Timelines, I'm sure you've all seen it. Many of you have had to deal with them. This is just kind of what I want to go over in keystones in Avali history. Starting with the very first hunter-gatherer societies, the tribes that slowly rose to become city-states, the rise of the first Illuminate, called the oligarchical or monarchist Illuminate. You may also hear the term fascist. Kind of a little fascist, a lot of fascist, but it's okay. I will go over all of that. We go from there to the actual revolution on early Avalon, into the more modern age, and from there we see the development of the species, growth and expansion and culture, and eventually its foray into the stars. That of which will be handled by the blue.
The blue.
The blue, yes. Go ahead, Tholin.
No, I turned off the fire breath.
So, in the beginning, Solaku gave light. In the beginning, in the blue beginning, if you will. Much like if you were to take many of the cultures on Earth, many of Avali started off as little more than hunting-gatherer tribes and packs scattered all across Avalon. Most of them were focused on the pursuit of game for sustenance. A pack or a tribe would follow the migratory patterns of the native fauna, flora, megafauna, and this was from before they were even Avali, when they were back when in the pre-Avali Avalids, I think is what we're going with. All across Avalon, these tribes more or less just went day to day to survive. And that was what it was for hundreds and hundreds of years. Eventually, though, certain tribes found that certain regions of the planet had more resources, had easier to find game, had funny rocks that if they hit them with hammers, the rocks decided to bend instead of shatter. And the earliest form of metallurgy, in the form of cold hammered bronze and copper, would have been found mostly along the coastlines. At this point in time, the geography of Avalon itself would have been very important in the foundation and formation of these early tribes. Sorry, my timer decided to kill itself.
Shit.
Go ahead to the next slide, Tholin. Thank you. Now, as these early tribes settled down a little bit, they found that these resource-hot locations, it was a lot better to more or less stop going around chasing, following these herds of animals, and that it was a lot more, it made more sense to stick around. So this is when the first cities kind of is what you'd call them, more or less permanent settlements of like structures would have been formed, where some tribes would build up these sites, and then in the wintertime they would stay down. Summertime they'd go out and hunt game, all the way down to like in the central region near the equator on the coast, where they just decided to build them up and live there permanently. This allowed for the domestication of livestock, the domestication of crops, and that in turn feeds into the development of culture, of civilization. More food, more people, more people, more food, more food, more people. You know how it goes. This, all in all, led to the very, very first city-states across Avalon. Many, just because of the deserts of Avalon, the climate, how cold it is, it's a little bit difficult to settle inland. There's vast swaths of it that are almost completely uninhabitable at this time. Especially to a group that is unprepared or is simply trying to pursue food. Therefore, besides the small groups of migratory, birds going to and from trading, everybody begins to settle in on these cities. Go ahead and swatch Tholin. This is when we have the Illuminate, but bad. We haven't really decided on a proper terminology for it. It's mostly referred to as just the evil Illuminate, the oligarchical Illuminate, monarchical, fascist, so be it. It is a specific city-state located in central Avalon that rose to power. Being uniquely situated in a location with lots of resources, a location with ample access to food, centralized trade routes, all of this, it all comes together to form one that is a little bit bigger than the rest. And bigger, obviously since we're bigger, we're going to be better. So they kind of start wandering out a little bit. They come across the outlying tribes, they come across the smaller city-states, and they think, well, you would be better served serving us. So this is when we see the very first actual violence start to break out. Obviously, a colonizing force is a force of violence, something of which would have been mostly unfamiliar to Avali at this time. A lot of early Avali settlements would have had violence amongst Avali as almost a foreign concept. Surely there would be conflict over resources. Say you have a hunting spot that you've hunted in since your forefathers have been there, and all of a sudden a new tribe's here. There might be a little bit of bickering, some rocks thrown back and forth. But as social creatures, as all the same birds of a feather, actual full-scale conflict wasn't really a thing. Until the Illuminate decided that they wanted more resources to bring back home. This is when the very first standing armies would have began marching across Avalon, and this is independent city-states more or less being unified on a almost planetary scale. This had never been seen before, and it was a force that nobody could really reckon with. They just had the resources, they had the populations, they had the power, and as they grew bigger, they only got more of that. Go ahead. The prelude to violence. Obviously, colonizing is already a form of violence, but we're not going to get into the semantics of that. What I do mean is actual armed resistance. Eventually, there reaches a point where enough is enough. And that just so happened to be the Industrial Revolution. It and its consequences were an utter disaster to the Avali race, as more advances in metallurgy, advances in the sciences, factories began to be formed, wide-scale resource, like industrialized farming, all sorts of new ways to exploit resources, to increase production, and to stratify workers. At this point, the classical class system of the working class, the upper class, the ruling class really became to form. And that wasn't very cool. For such a social species, you don't really like being trampled on, and those who were doing the trampling, a lot of them honestly didn't enjoy it either. But everybody was locked into their place. The outlying outskirts of the Illuminate being the most economically destitute, as you moved in towards Central, became a little bit more, I guess middle class would be a way to put it, where they have the more industrialized farms and factories, but factory workers are still factory workers who are oppressed and have most of their labor exploited and sent down to the rich elite. This isn't very cool. So eventually enough is enough, and while it's kind of hard to nail down where it would have started, most accounts would say somewhere near the north, there would have been resistance. It could have been so much as a single town, a single camp of birds not wanting to be forced under the jackboot of the Illuminate. They fought back. And this was the shot heard all around the moon, all around Avalon, to show that there is another option. We don't have to be beholden to this organization. We can do better. We can be better. And then fighting broke out. Go ahead, Tholin. It was slow at first. Obviously, an armed resistance on a planetary scale is going to be very disorganized, which, of course, ended up being a valuable asset to it. You know, who needs timers? It's okay. The initial shock of so much as a small group of Avali resisting the oppression of the Illuminate would have been just absolutely mind-boggling. This had never happened before. This was a professional army. This was the only professional army on the entirety of Avalon. And they were now having farmers, they were having just day-to-day birds fight back. They weren't used to this. That shock wore off quickly, and eventually it became a very slow armed conflict. The revolutionaries, they had the numbers. There was almost the entire planet, after all, that didn't want to be forced under the heel of a single city anymore. So they had the numbers where the Illuminate had the fighting power, and this led to every battle being won mostly through sheer numbers, a price paid in blood 4 times over to the revolutionaries. It wasn't good, but they were fighting for a cause. They were fighting for free Avalon, and eventually, especially as fighting went on, conscripts from the outer regions would defect en masse, join the resistance, and then there would be more and more resources, more and more people, more and more bodies to fight the Illuminate. Go ahead, Tholin. This would come to a head as the cities, or as the revolutionaries eventually would work their way across the globe down to the very city itself, and the storming of the it'd be the storming of basically the Imperial Palace, the oligarchical center, marking the end of the revolution. And this is where the calendar starts at 0, funny enough. All of this violence would lead to mass disruption of everything. So we have a bunch of birds. They have just successfully stopped an evil government from taking over the entire planet. They're very proud of themselves. They don't want it to happen again. And they look, and they see this massive planet-wide network of infrastructure, of industry, of communications, and they don't know what to do with it. In this period of time, it's the Reconstruction. This This is when Avali as a whole kind of get together. They write the Constitution. They form inalienable rights of all Avalis, no longer to be required to be stratified. The individuality of them all, and that they all do hold free will, to which, these truths are self-evident, all of that jazz. But in addition to that, they got a whole planet now to play with a lot of industry in place. So expansion booms. Science, technology, communications, all of it just takes off and they run with it. No longer are they censored, no longer are they required to give in to a single power. There is just immeasurable growth in culture and technology and industry, all sorts of magical technologies. You've got medicine, which brings the average lifespan of the Avali. It increases almost by 2. It's incredible. And this kind of feeds into its own problems. If you'll go ahead, Tholin. With this amazing, technological, scientific revolution, Avali would slowly begin to encounter the 3 big hurdles of their civilization. Now, a unified front. These hurdles were the biggest threats to Avali kind. The very first one of these would have been the population crisis. With lifespans growing, with modern medicine making it so that people are able to survive more injuries, with basic rights being given to all to be able to uplift those who need help, to no longer trample them. This leads to a lot of new birds. A lot of new birds living in the same amount of houses means there's a lot of overcrowding. At this point in time, there would be a lot of expansion in the sense of new cities would be built, new frontiers established further on into the deserts of Avalon, places that may have been partially inhospitable at times being, taken over and made livable. Cities would develop, urban centers would really start to develop. You'd see skyscrapers reaching up into the stars, all of this to kind of go inside with the increase in population. And of course, as that is finally tackled, and as the overpopulation is kind of taken care of, all the resources that have to be dedicated into that, now with a lot of birds, what do birds do when there's a lot of them? Well, they chirp. They chirp and they chirp, and they chirp a lot. Unfortunately, not all of those birds are going to be chirping the truth. This is when the information crisis starts. Globalization, with hundreds of thousands of Avali everywhere, leads some of them. They're going to be doing it they're going to be in for their own skin. They're going to be selfish. They're going to be spreading misinformation. This is going to be, this is when the birth of a global nexus, a communications network that all of Avali would be able to tune into. This is when that advent happens. No longer are we needing telegraph poles, semaphore towers. We've got instantaneous communications. Not everybody's going to use that for good reasons. This takes the world by storm, and suddenly nobody knows truth from fiction. And when this happens, there's the threat of violence. There are people who want to, there could even be people who think that the old fascist Illuminate were actually the good guys and think they should come back. This is when actual laws and political processes are put in place to maintain objective viewpoints, to maintain a more factual point of view, to stop bad actors, to stop fake news from spreading. It's not super popular, obviously, but it's a slow process, and thankfully, due to the rights and everything enshrined in the Constitution of the Illuminate, this crisis is mostly handled with some grace. Obviously there's a few riots, but what's a good riot? Finally is the resource crisis. Avalon, being a moon, is filled with natural resources. There are a lot of metals, but not all of them are easily accessible. Vast deserts cover the planet, ice sheets that make it rather inaccessible, and what resources are not frozen in the ice are under the ocean. While there might be thousands upon thousands of tons of uranium, it's not really easy if you can't get to it. This is when the Illuminate now realize that the easily accessible resources, they've all been gobbled up through to the advances of technology, and that they need more. At first, let's build submarines. Let's go underground. Let's go deep core mining. Let's get everything and yank it out. And it's great till it's not, because there's only so much down there. And this is where things really start to get into a trouble. So the planet it's only got so many resources, and the birds, they keep growing, they keep expanding, and there's not a lot of things to do. This is when, what are we to do when we don't have anything on the ground? Well, we look up.
It's my part.
It's blue.
It's my part.
I know.
Wait.
I can't
But you have to let go of
the slides. I didn't want to.
Yeah, but you have to. Wait. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, before we continue, I'd like to quickly remind everyone about the kind of timescales we're working with here. The monarchical Illuminate actually ruled for about 100 years uninterrupted. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but 1 year on Avalon is 13 Earth years. So there's actually 1,300 years of uncontested rule, which is mostly because if you were living inside the Illuminate at the time, it wasn't really bad. They didn't start out being extremely oppressive. It's just that as the Industrial Revolution started and the social stratification, and the Illuminate began using the technology from that Industrial Revolution to wage warfare, that is when things got bad. The revolution lasted about 1 year from start to finish, and after that was over and they formed the Illuminate Republic, they formed a democracy, they did that, it continues to persist to this day over like several hundred years. So, and not several hundred, several decades. So this is about the time scale that we're dealing with. So as Elya has already introduced us to, the resource crisis starts like a decade or so after the beginning of the population crisis, as a result of the drain on resources that's required to construct cities. You have to remember that Avalon is mostly inhospitable, and although the Illuminate first thinks of constructing more cities along the coast, that would mean bulldozing the remaining rainforests, and that was not received very well. What's a good riot? So they decide that they're going to do the difficult thing of trying to build cities in the icy deserts. So it's a lot like Las Vegas or Phoenix, just like instead of a hot desert, it's an icy desert. And that's actually where they developed a lot of the technology that they would use later on for space colonization. They had to already colonize a very difficult environment of their own home world, and it gave them a lot of experience. However, for now, the resource crisis has begun. More and more mines are being depleted. A lot of the surface of Avalon is inaccessible under a thick ice sheet. And, subsurface ocean mining is already being done, but mostly just to get things like uranium, where it's worth the trouble. And so many solutions are tried and proposed for solving this crisis. So, for instance, a massive shift towards recycling. But ultimately, even that can only get you so far, because you always lose something. You always have losses. And ultimately, when you build a building, that metal that you use for that is essentially used up forever. And so eventually someone came up with the idea of, hey, what if we went to space? Because there's like 4 moons up there, and I'm sure they have like juicy metal deposits. This is something that was not really tried for a really long time, because rockets are very resource intensive to build and to launch, and that was seen as a massive waste. And so it took a really, really long time for anyone to really seriously consider the idea. So things were kind of already in the stages of getting a little bit desperate. Only then did the proposal of having a space program really walk its way through the democratic process in order to end up becoming a real thing. Actually almost failed. They launched like 6 or 7 attempts at an orbital rocket, and every single one exploded. So that was not a good look. But but in the end, it takes off. So yeah. So they managed to eventually get their first orbital flight with the first Avali touching down on another celestial body shortly after, where they deploy some probes, they dig into the ground a little bit, and they find, yes, indeed, there's at least a lot of metal here. And mining operations begin almost immediately. So we're talking about intercepting all of the little asteroid moons that orbit around Valaya, and eventually also landing on the moon, on the like bigger moons, like Ralu, which has extensive metal deposits, and bringing back that metal to Avalon. And so this kind of begins a period of history that is known as, colloquially, as the expansion. And so similar to the Industrial Revolution, the expansion proceeds in stages. And the first of these is what I just explained, is just trying to solve the resource crisis on Avalon, and mostly entails the mining of the local moon system. However, eventually the focus kind of shifts, right? Because not only is Avalikin running out of resources on Avalon, they're also kind of running out of space, and also, if they're going to be doing all of this activity in space, why not have people live there? And so now the focus became, can we build new homes entirely in space instead of just trying to bring everything back to our current home? Can we also make new homes? And of course, there were already massive mining colonies on places like the moon Ralu, but these were kind of habitation was kind of a secondary thing there. But there were some candidates in the interplanetary space, like for instance Solvis, which had it was quite hot for Avali, but it had liquid water oceans. And an atmosphere with nitrogen in it. You can make ammonia in situ. It's pretty much the only place where you can really do that easily. And so attempts were made to colonize these different places, and also try and see if you can exploit them, maybe. But interplanetary travel is kind of difficult. It takes a lot of energy to do, and you have limited carrying capacity. So it's not really something that was done unless maybe a planet had a lot of something really, really valuable, like gold or uranium. No, unobtainium. So the third stage is kind of not really a stage of the expansion as much. It's kind of just one thing, and that is the Xinrod-Storley project. So Avalon or rather not just Avalon, its whole star system, the solar system, being very close to the galactic core means it's in a area of space where there's a lot of stars. If any of you have ever played Elite Dangerous and taken a trip out to Sagittarius A-star, you know what I mean. So there is a lot of stuff in immediate range, even if you don't have FTL travel yet. If you have like nuclear fission or fusion engines, which are being developed at the time, you can yeet something off at like 10% the speed of light and get to somewhere in just a few Earth years. And so that's what they did. And they found a planet that had liquid ammonia on its surface, just one star system over, like one light year away. And that was interesting, because that could potentially be a new place to establish a large Avali civilization, because the whole thing had habitable temperatures, it had liquid ammonia. It's just that it had like way too high gravity for Avali to survive. Luckily, genetic modification and like augmentation was being developed at the time and slowly being greenlit by the Illuminate, which was very controversial thing as well. I won't get into that. But the crew that eventually made their way to Xinrod-Storley were heavily augmented. It was a requirement. And so the idea was for Xinrod-Storley to essentially become Avalon 2, the sequel, where where they were supposed to build like entire cities over there, and using locally available resources from the very metal-rich planet to sort of build up an economy, an entire economy and industry in place. And this kind of began using crafts that would use FTL engines, not FTL, pre-FTL engines, so nuclear fusion thrusters, to yeet themselves that light year at like 10% the speed of light, then stop and then land and be deconstructed into the first pieces of the colonies, with a stream of more ships being sent after with everything else you might need, like machinery and construction materials. And at this point, however, the first experiments began with developing some way of traveling faster than light, which, the very first attempts to build an FTL drive ended in like several stacks of redacted government documents and like dozens of Avali mysteriously disappearing and like several labs on fire. But they eventually developed the Courage drive, which is capable of bending space. It's essentially their version of the Alcubierre drive that they end up constructing. And the first versions of it are really terrible. They suck a lot of power. They're really bulky and difficult and expensive to build, and they can't even go that fast. But of course, it's a technology, and so, that was the worst it was ever going to be. And so they begin enhancing it until it's eventually able to haul cargo at reasonable speeds. And that's when things really begin to take off, as the Illuminate realizes that they now have literally millions of star systems within reasonable reach, all of them with potentially habitable planets around them. And so that's when the interstellar colonization of the galaxy starts, or rather of the immediate bubble of a few hundred light years, where they would essentially plop down colonies, factories on habitable planets that would then churn out parts for more colonies, sort of kind of self-perpetuating the whole thing. And of course, the whole thing was being sold to the Avali people as, oh, well, this is going to be, this is our heritage for the Illuminate, the stars are ours, and we can build our glorious futuristic future here. And yeah, you would walk down the street and you would see like free posters asking you to sign up to become a colonist. And this is also, over the whole 4 stages, there's a rise of the EMD or EMA. So the Extraction and Manufacturing Division is something that started out as a division of the regular space program, but eventually got split off into an agency, because their job was to actually, the space program's job was to explore and do science. EMD's job was to then figure out how to use the results of that in an exploitative way to obtain more resources. And eventually that overshadowed every other goal. And so it became its own independent agency, and it gained more and more power, and eventually control over the whole operation essentially slips from the Illuminate's paws. So essentially what happens is almost like a regression. The novelty of everything that happened, of the whole expansion and the kind of like the Avali version of Manifest Destiny here, it quickly wears off, and the promised glory and higher standards of living does not manifest for many. In fact, a lot of Avali get stuck in mediocre factory colonies instead of one of the large prosperous ones, of which there were very few. And this kind of lowered the quality of life for many. But most important, even if you were in one of the good colonies, likely chances your political representation was zero. You were far away from home. Your only chance to, say, vote in elections was to do mail-in over slow FTL ships that might not even arrive in time, if you even got the chance. It was basically the whole outer colonies. The farther away you get, the worse it gets. So it was like a massive political blind spot out there. And also bad blood was developing between Xinwat Storley and the Illuminate, because Xinwat Storley was supposed to be the big thing and was supposed to be Avalon too. But as the expansion proceeds, the Illuminate kind of starts ignoring Xinwat Storley as just one more colony, and they kind of are pissed off by that. They feel very abandoned and mistreated by the Illuminate. And the Illuminate itself is also spread too thin. You have to understand that the amount of habitable surface area on Avalon is about 1.5 to 2 times the surface area of the continental United States. And now they're suddenly having to go from administrating that amount of area to several hundred light years worth of territory. And ultimately that just, they can't keep up. The government is spread incredibly thin, which causes these issues that I've just explained to even manifest in the first place, despite the fact that they theoretically shouldn't under their constitution. Also, first contact with Earth, with humanity, happens at some point during this, and the site of a notable stellar phenomenon that both Avali and humans have noticed and went to observe. And although the Illuminate quickly adopts isolationism, and humanity does as well towards the Illuminate, the Avali kind of scare the humans with how quickly they're expanding. There's an unusual friendship that develops between Xinwat Storley and Earth, so there's a lot of cultural exchange happening between the two, and also and the outer colonies, they really kind of begin to look up to Xinward Storley because Xinward Storley's got a kind of the largest voice in this whole anti-expansion like protest that's happening slowly. And so a lot of people are looking up to Xinward Storley, and so a lot of this cultural contamination from humanity to Xinward Storley kind of starts trickling down to the colonies as well. I would also like to note at this point that the Illuminate is picky. Within, like, there's millions of stars in their FTL range. They're not colonizing every single good planet that they see. They're really able to be picky and seek out all the good stuff. The total number of colonies that they end up building is also only in the about 100 to 300 range by the end of it, but that's still a lot. And also the large-scale use of automation was common, so this is not like the Industrial Revolution again. Not quite, where workers are being exploited for menial labor. There's a lot of machines being used, a lot of drones, things like that. And while a lot of resources that were like created and manufactured would be funneled back into the expansion, a lot were also just plain hoarded by the Illuminate. And I'm not saying that individual colonies didn't try to become proper homes. They didn't try to govern themselves and make lives make lives good for the people living there. But it's just that the main pain points were just the sheer isolation, which Avali don't like, the shortage of specific goods, like whatever your colony didn't produce had to be imported, and then often meant there was a lot of shortage of really common items, as well as and like the lack of independence and political representation really led to a very bad morale. So ultimately, I am going to need a drink of water because my throat is dry.
Cheers.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm still holding the microphone. I think I accidentally let go. Yeah. Okay. So, at this point, protests and full-on riots are becoming more common within the colonies. Xinward's, and that ultimately culminates in Xinward Storley taking a page out of human history and declaring their independence, announcing themselves to now be the Xinward Storley Independency. And you have to understand, at this point, the Illuminate Republic has been Avalon's sole government for like decades, which is hundreds of Earth years. And suddenly, a part of them is trying to break away. This is completely unheard of. And so, while you might expect some kind of conflict, some kind of war between these nations, that doesn't really happen. The Illuminate is so blindsided by this, and they're also still very much spread thin and trying to get a hold of this whole operation that's going on. They can't really react in any meaningful way within a meaningful time frame. And ultimately, at this point, the resistance to the expansion is becoming overwhelming. And ultimately, the day that Xinward Storley declared independence is the day that the expansion ended. The current government basically collapses, and it is being replaced by one that is led by the leadership of something called the United Colonies Coalition, who promises to put a stop to all this madness that's been going on, which is when the brake is finally pulled. This ends up being a massive expense, because you have to understand that this has been going on for like over a decade at this point, this expansion, and it has become such a massive thing that the Illuminate basically lost control of it. The whole thing was basically a runaway train, and stopping it would require a massive expense of a years-long cleanup operation. Like, you have to send a bunch of Avali around, maybe back to other colonies or back home. You have to deconstruct abandoned colonies. And you have to fix all of the infrastructural issues that have been going on for years at this point, and this ends up carrying with it a insane cost. However, the resulting social policies that are implemented by the UCC as part of this end up being extremely popular, which basically solidifies their rule for the following decades. Now, so it's the end of an era, basically. So at this point, we get to this very interesting part in Avali history, because Xinrod Stoli declaring independence, he obviously sent a very powerful message to all of the outer colonies. And a lot of them are really on board with the idea of doing that. It's just they're not self-sustaining in the same way. Xinrod Stoli could do this because they had the upper hand. They were completely self-sustaining. They were growing their own food. They were constructing their own, daily items, utilities. They were basically running themselves already. But the expansion kind of relied upon them because Xinrod Stoli was the place where a lot of microelectronics and other complex goods were being manufactured, and so they could essentially use that as a negotiation tactic. But other colonies, they not necessarily that lucky. As I said, there were a few big hub colonies, prosperous ones, that could attempt this, but yeah. However, as time progressed and as these colonies were, being kind of either abandoned or built up by UCC, more and more of them just kind of gained the courage and gained the ability to walk out. And at this point, the Illuminate essentially kind of gave up trying to stop them because, as I said, governing something that is like a light years large bit of territory is really difficult. And at some point, letting them go is kind of just becomes the easier solution. Like the easiest solution to their best solution to a problem is often the easiest one. In this case, it's just letting people walk out. Right, because at this point, the Illuminate was still being strained extremely intensely. However, this kind of had the effect of raising tensions in the long run, because you have all of these independent Avali nations now that are kind of competing a little bit. And so, we get to the point where defense contractors are very happy, at least for a year or so. But why did you raise your hand, Roger?
I was just adjusting the cable. Sorry.
Yeah, and it takes until the next generation of Avali takes power that things kind of begin to come back down from that tension. Because at this point, Avali have been in space for so long that there was entire packs that have grown up on planets other than Avalon, have maybe even grown up in space on a ship or on a space station. There are now Avali alive that are adults or like halfway through adulthood and have never touched a planetary surface in their entire lives. And these are the people who have kind of lived this reality of raising tensions and maybe still somewhat mediocre ways of life that are now building bridges, trying to find a better solution. And ultimately, the idea they come up with is the Solakian Union, which is the European Union at home. Illuminate, can we have European Union? No, we have European Union at home, and it's the Solakian Union, which is a series of treaties and contracts between all of the different Avali nations that exist in space, intended to kind of regulate and standardize trade and travel and defense, among other things. You kind of bring everyone together again, but not in the same way as the Illuminate was before, where it was all under one strict government. The point is to preserve the independency of the individual state while still getting them to cooperate on things. And the whole thing is presided over by the special council, Hello? Yeah. Anyway, so they have their own flag. That's what it looks like. It's a flag of the Solakian Union.
That's the one from Eurofriends.
Yes. Solakian Union flag real. Okay, I think, Elya, this is your bit?
Yes. Oh, floating again. Lovely.
I hope I made any sense at all there, by the way.
You were amazing, Tholin. Thank you very much. Yes, but all in all, that's it's a little bit of a work in progress, obviously. History, even like all history, though, is really a work in progress. Even the history that people have lived is constantly rediscovered. There are always gaps to be filled. There is a lot of time. The entire history of Avali spans hundreds upon thousands of Earth years. One Avali year is approximately 13 Earth years. So even the revolution only lasting a single year on Avalon is a massive amount of time. There's so much just sheer stuff happening There's so much, and there's lots to get into. We could get into the details on the tri-feather Illuminate logo being a symbol of the resistance at first, the unity between the various, outlying cultures. There's a lot that we can get into. There's a lot that still needs to be got into, and just absolute multitudes of work still to be done, just to kind of flesh things out. Obviously, none of this is set in stone. History is written by the victors, and the victors happen to be... Yes, that's not actually... History is not written by the victors, but it's not really important. But in summary, that's a brief history of the Avali, a brief history of the Illuminate. It's rise, fall, rise again, fall again. History's a circle, all of that. I don't really have any more remarks. Tholin, do you?
That's literally the end of the presentation. So yeah.
Well, yeah,
You can now
I
ask
figured,
for
but
questions.
Yes, thank you so much for listening to us yap endlessly about our hyperfixations. Questions, come on down. We'll happily answer them.
Boy, thanks, guys.
What are you doing, Josh?
Boy, so
Not much.